Hello everybody, can you believe we're starting week 5 in person if you'd like, online if you'd like. I am amazed Shepherd is still going strong and that, we haven't had any major outbreaks or anything, so keep up that social distancing. Come on, earring. Keep up that social distancing and, stay safe, stay clean. So, we just saw the video on essentially the basics of our Ultimaker 3D printers, and now we're going to talk about the slicing program. So this is assuming that we've already made our 3D models in Rhino, or we've downloaded our 3D models, and we want to start 3D printing them. And we have to bring them into this program. Again, because we need to be able to tell the machine what to do. And Rhino is good at modeling, but not good at telling robots how to do robot things. So this program is specifically made for the Ultimaker 3D printers. And it's going to essentially take your 3D model and slice it layer by layer by layer so that we can, so it can tell the printer how to move each layer. And then move to the next layer and so on and construct your object. So this link is in the lab documents. Please download Ultimaker Curea for PC, Mac, whatever you have. And I'm going to expand this window. Come on. There we go. And just right now, basically what we're looking at is the Ultimaker build platform is what it's called. And you can kind of see this is similar to the build plate that we were looking at in the last video. Now it looks like it's not square, but it is rectangular, it is all 90 degrees square, and the essentially white, light gray areas is where we can build things. Now this build plate is set for the Ultimaker 3. Now when you first open the program, it's going to ask you which Ultimaker would you like to use, and you can do Ultimaker 3. Now we also can add a printer. You can come and add a printer, and we can add non-networked printer, and we can do an S3, which we can add. Now, sometimes it's important to add these multiple printers because some of them might be used. You might only be able to do special things with certain ones. For example, the Ultimaker S3 is really good at doing really fine detail and doing really sort of more experimental plastics. Now, we can also add the Ultimaker 2 Extended, and what that means is that's just going to have a bigger build plate. So when we go to an extended version, you can see how big our build plate is, which is this, blued area. It's much taller. So if you have a very tall object you want to print, you might want to use the Ultimaker 2 Extended. But we're just going to go back to the 3 for right now. And it's going to kind of shrink back down. There we go. Now, the nice thing about the Ultimakers, especially the 3s, is we've got options for doing multiple plastics. If we have to use a very specific plastic for making a support structure and things like that, we're going to drop that down, and we're going to go to the second one, and we're going to actually disable it. So usually when you find it, it's going to be checked, and it's going to say, oh, which material, blah, blah, blah. We're going to just deselect that, all right? So that we're not using, come on there we go. And so we're only using the first printer head, okay? Or what I showed you in the video as an extruder. And some of them have 2 extruders. The one in the video I showed you was the extended, which only has 1 extruder. And we're just going to stick with generic PLA for right now. There are specific filaments by Ultimaker that you can pick, but right now just generic PLA. And the printer core, we're going to stick with the 0.4. All right. Oh. When you do make a change, it's going to say, oh, you've made a change, and we're just going to keep those changes if you make anything up here. Now, so these are for, this menu right up here is for the extruders. Now, this menu over here is going to be for the details of printing things. And generally, sometimes what you see is you just see recommended, okay? And you have different profiles here. Now, these numbers up here for profiles, that is your layer thickness. In a sense, that's kind of saying, what is my resolution? The thicker your layer is, the quicker your print is going to go, but the lower resolution you'll have. So you can get really low resolution, or you can get really detailed resolution. Your infill is essentially a support structure that is on the inside. If I look at this 3D print right here, and I'm going to bring it closer to the camera, you can see it's got this honeycomb structure inside of it. Now that honeycomb structure is your infill, and depending on what you're doing, you might want it to be like really strong. You might have a high infill so that it can be very structurally tight. Now, sometimes you don't really even need infill depending on what you're doing. If it's a really thin walled model, you might not need any infill at all, or you might need just a little bit. Generally, we keep it between 10 and 20, if any at all. Now we also have here is the support, which generates a support structure for things that are overhanging. Let's see, do I have a good example? If I look at our standard masks, do you see this section right here that's coming out, that's really flat, that's overhanging? Now when the printer comes up to this point, it's going to move over and it's going to try to print, but there's nothing underneath it, right? Because it's building layer by layer by layer by layer, and right here, there's nothing underneath it. And so it's going to try to extrude that little plastic filament into empty space, because there's nothing underneath it. And so what support structure does is it prints just a little bit of material in this region so that when it gets to this point, that plastic won't just fall into free air. There'll be something underneath it, and you just break that support structure off later. Adhesion, which is our next element that we can change, is something that you can change to depending on what the base of your model is. Sorry, I got a little off track there. Depending on the base of your model, you might need support in terms to support of holding it down. All right. So if your part has a really big base, then you probably don't need any assistance adhering it because there's a larger footprint for it to hold on to. For example, the star that I showed, that's actually a pretty decent sized footprint. Whereas if I have something that has very little feet, like this, has almost no footprint to it at all, it's just 3 little points, you might need to have special adhesion to the batten. And we'll go over that detail. Now these here are our standard sort of settings, just kind of recommended. We can go into custom and we can change all of these details with these different drop-down menus. I'm going to expand this down so we can see. And first off is quality, which is again going to be basically your layer height. Now you can edit that to be something very specific. We also have standard profiles up here in this profile drop-down menu, which is a good place to start with. And you can also create a profile from these settings as well. And we're just going to keep it on normal for right now. No need. Shell. Really with shell, what you're looking at is wall thickness. And here it's 1 millimeter. You can also do wall line count, which essentially you can just say, okay, I want it 3 layers deep of the extruded line that the printer head is going to make. And then there are some details here between top and bottom thickness and things like that. In general, just to start off with, you're probably going to play around with wall thickness. Infill, we discussed that as the inner structure. Now, with this option is you have a lot of different options to change what does that inner structure look like. Triangles are going to be your strongest because triangle is the strongest shape. And there are some other options here. This star, for example, had hexagons. Material. Now that is something if you want to actually edit the properties that the printer is going to use for that material. Generally, when you pick a material for your printer head, it translates that into here. So you generally don't really need to play around with that. Speed, again, that's based off of, thickness or your profile, whether it's going to be a thicker layer or a thinner layer, high resolution, low resolution. You don't really need to play around with that. Same thing with traveling. Cooling, you can edit the fan speed depending on details of your print. Support, the biggest thing about support is you've got these options where you can say, you can have it everywhere, which means support could be built on top of the model itself. So if you have a part of the model that's overhanging another part, or it's overhanging above, part of the object below it, it will build that support structure on top of the part. Or you can say, no, I only want support structure that is going to come from the bed, or it's only going to be touching the build plate. Which means that it's not going to print any support structure on the object itself. Now, the angle is also important here because you can change the angle is the angle from the material. So if I look at this is actually almost like 90 degrees coming out. Now, if that angle were to change, it would go up, 60 and so on to 0 from center. So for example, here, this like subtle curve right here, that's going from 0 all the way to maybe 80 or so. And then, right at this point, it's going to be 90. 60 is generally a good starting point, and that's when the layers cannot be supported by the layer below it. Build plate adhesion, this is also a pretty big one because you've got options of a skirt, which just prints a bunch of multiple layers. We'll see that in a second. A brim is something that is a little bit thicker, and the raft is actually going to print multiple layers. That is important if you don't have something even. It's like really uneven, like everywhere. There's no flat piece to it, or no points of contact. And then dual extrusion is a more advanced option when you've got multiple plastics. All right, I'm going to close this. So those are the basic options for your Ultimaker. I'm going to stop this video and we're going to move on to the next video when I'm going to bring in an object. And we'll talk about how we can manipulate it from there.